Imagine walking into your own store, disguised as a regular customer, only to be met with an unexpected shock. An employee refuses to help you. Thinking you're just another passerby. What happens next will leave you speechless. Can the CEO confront this betrayal and turn the tide? Stick around to find out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. It was a crisp Thursday morning when Richard Wheeler, the CEO of a prominent tech company, stepped into the bustling downtown office. The city was alive with its usual hum, cars honking, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional sound of the subway rushing beneath the streets. But inside the sleek glass building that bore the company's name, Richard felt oddly detached, almost like a stranger in his own empire. The truth was, Richard had grown uneasy with the direction his company had been heading in recent months. As a leader who always prided himself on fairness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through the cracks. The company had always been built on the ideals of transparency, customer service, and delivering value to its clients. But lately, there had been rumors of dissatisfaction within the ranks. Some employees were talking about shifting priorities, others about new policies that seemed to favor VIP customers over the everyday ones, the backbone of the business. Richard knew this could erode everything he'd worked so hard to build. But he couldn't pinpoint exactly how or why. Today, he had decided to do something drastic. He wasn't just going to look at reports or hear the gossip from his executives. No, Richard had decided to become a customer, to visit one of the company's branches in disguise and experience the service firsthand. With a pair of glasses and a simple jacket, he could blend in among the everyday clients, a fly on the wall in his own business. Walking through the door of the branch, Richard was greeted by the hum of employees at their desks, busy with phones and emails. He scanned the room, watching employees shuffle back and forth. But then, he approached the counter where a young woman with dark hair was sitting. She looked up from her screen, eyeing him up and down with a dismissive glance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat, almost disinterested. "I'd like some assistance with a product I'm considering purchasing," Richard said, keeping his voice neutral. Her eyes flicked briefly to the queue behind him, then back to him, sizing him up. "You're not on the VIP list," she said curtly, tapping away at her keyboard as if his request had been an inconvenience. Richard was taken aback. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to understand if this was some sort of misunderstanding. "We only assist VIP customers with that," she replied, without even looking up. He stood there for a moment, stunned. Was this a joke? His mind raced. Was this how they treated all their customers now? He had been a loyal supporter of the company for years. And now here he was, being brushed off like any other non-VIP. Richard's brow furrowed as he stepped back, his mind spinning. He watched the woman's interaction with other customers. Each person who came up to the counter was treated with the same cold indifference. Unless they were VIPs, then there was an almost instant transformation. A warmer smile, quicker service. Something felt very wrong. As he continued to watch, Richard's unease grew. It wasn't just this one employee. No, it was a systemic problem. A culture was building here that was more concerned with hierarchy than genuine customer care. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a flaw that ran deeper than he could have imagined. Richard didn't need to ask more questions. He had seen enough. He knew this was bigger than just a few bad apples. It was a systemic issue that could tarnish everything the company had worked so hard to build. His gut told him that something needed to be done, but what? How deep did the rot go? And how would he fix it? Richard Wheeler had barely stepped out of the branch when the unease he felt began to take root in his mind. The brief interaction with the cold, dismissive employee lingered, gnawing at him. He had experienced customer service issues before. But this felt different. It wasn't just one person with a bad attitude, it was systemic. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something was terribly wrong with the way his company was treating its customers. By the next day, Richard was back at his desk, reviewing reports and making a few calls. He tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to that branch, the way the staff interacted with customers, the way they ignored the regulars, the way they only perked up when a VIP entered. He had seen enough to know that something wasn't right, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this went deeper than just one location. He decided to dig deeper. Richard reached out to several branch managers, asking for their perspectives on customer service practices. He arranged to visit a few other branches undercover, just as he had done before. The more he asked, the more he saw patterns that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't just one bad apple here or there. The coldness, the clear distinction between VIP and non-VIP customers, it was everywhere. As he walked through another branch, this time without even bothering to disguise himself, he witnessed it firsthand. The same behavior from the staff, gruff and detached unless they were dealing with someone they deemed important. Customers were left to stand in line for longer than necessary. Some ignored completely until it was convenient. The non-VIPs? They were lucky to get a simple acknowledgement. Richard's thoughts turned darker as he walked through the rows of products. He couldn't pinpoint when it had started, but it was undeniable now. The culture inside his company had shifted. There was a clear bias running through the ranks, one that threatened to undermine everything he had built. He began to wonder how many customers had been affected, how many complaints had gone unheard, how many employees had silently acquiesced to this new order. It wasn't just bad customer service, it was a breach of the very values his company was built on. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about one employee or one branch. No, this was about something bigger, something that reached into the heart of the organization itself. There had to be a reason for this culture to take hold. A reason why this was allowed to continue unchecked. His suspicions grew when he reviewed the employee logs. Richard noticed that several employees had suddenly resigned or were moved to different positions without explanation. 2 of them had been part of the customer service team, the very team that had exhibited the worst behavior. It didn't add up. Something wasn't right. Then, as he dug deeper into the company's internal systems, he found something that chilled him to the bone. A document, which had been flagged for deletion, contained policies regarding customer service, policies that were not just flawed but dangerously discriminatory. The file had been tampered with, and whoever had done it had been careful. Too careful. Richard sat back, staring at the screen. The pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone inside the company, someone with access, had been intentionally altering the way the company interacted with its customers. He couldn't shake the thought. This was bigger than he had imagined. There was a deliberate effort to favor certain groups while alienating the rest. Then came the final blow. One of the employees he had been tracking, a senior manager, had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No word, no warning, no explanation. It wasn't like this employee to just vanish. Richard could feel the knot in his stomach tighten. This was no longer just about bad policy. This was about something far more sinister, a conspiracy. Maybe even a cover-up. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from an anonymous tipster, someone within the company, pointing to a high-level executive who might be behind the manipulation of customer service policies. The message was vague but pointed enough to set Richard's mind racing. The pieces were coming together, but they didn't make a pretty picture. Richard's pulse quickened. He had to act fast. This wasn't just a matter of poor service or disgruntled employees. This was an issue of integrity, and he was at the heart of it. The only way to solve this was to go straight to the top. He knew what he had to do. Richard picked up the phone and called a meeting with the top executives. His decision was made. He wasn't going to let this fester any longer. It was time to get to the bottom of this, and to do whatever it took to restore his company's reputation. Meeting in an hour. He typed into his phone, sending the message to the board. He was ready for the fight ahead. But as he sat there, waiting for the others to arrive, one thought echoed in his mind. Who else was involved? And just how far did this go? Richard Wheeler had always prided himself on being a hands-on leader. Someone who kept his ear to the ground and his eyes open. But now, as he sat in his office, he knew that hands-on wasn't enough. This was bigger than a simple case of bad service. This was systemic, and it had to be stopped before it did more damage to the company. For the past few days, he had been undercover, slipping in and out of different branches as a regular customer. What he had seen so far confirmed his suspicions. The treatment of non-VIP customers was nothing short of appalling. But Richard needed more than just his observations, he needed concrete evidence. Something irrefutable that would make it impossible to ignore the problem. He knew that some employees had to be aware of what was going on. He had reached out to a former employee, Paul Anderson, who had worked at one of the branches until he was abruptly let go. Paul had been a vocal critic of the company's shift in policy. And his firing was suspicious. Richard suspected Paul might have some insight into the situation, so he reached out to him for a meeting. The two met in a quiet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the company. As soon as Paul sat down across from Richard, it was clear that the man hadn't found peace since his departure from the company. His face was worn, the weight of 100 unanswered questions hanging over him. Still, when Richard explained why he needed his help, Paul hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "They've been doing this for months," Paul said in a low voice, looking around nervously. The whole shift in policy. It wasn't just some isolated thing. There were meetings, secret meetings, about how to prioritize VIPs and make sure the regulars felt less important. Richard's heart sank as Paul spoke. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it from someone who had been inside the machine made it feel all the more real. Paul continued, his voice trembling as he spoke about the internal politics that had been at play. The meetings, the decisions, the push for VIP treatment. It wasn't just about making more money. It was about control. "I didn't want to be a part of it," Paul said, his eyes darting around the cafe. "But I couldn't stop it. When I started speaking up about it, they told me I was a liability. Next thing I know, I was out." Richard felt a pang of guilt for not having noticed this sooner. If Paul had been vocal enough to get fired over it, that meant the problem was much bigger than he had ever imagined. Richard leaned forward, his voice firm. "I need to know everything, Paul. All of it, every detail." Paul nodded and slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails and documents, proof of the secret meetings, the memos, and the twisted logic behind the VIP policies. Richard took a deep breath. This was what he needed, proof. But as he sifted through the pages, he noticed something odd. One of the documents had a date that didn't match up. The text had been altered, and when he tried to open the file on his laptop later, it was nowhere to be found. Someone had deleted it. Richard's pulse quickened. He had been so close. But now, it was clear. Someone on the inside was actively covering their tracks. The discovery sent Richard into a spiral of frustration and determination. He needed to act fast. He couldn't let this slide. Not after everything he had uncovered. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Paul. "Be careful. They're watching. I just got a call. And they told me to keep quiet. I'm scared, Richard. I don't know who's involved. But they'll stop at nothing." Richard's heart sank. The stakes were higher than ever. And Paul was now in danger. But there was no turning back. Richard couldn't let the people behind this conspiracy get away with it. He knew what he had to do. He immediately scheduled a meeting with his top executives for the next morning. It was time to take action. But as he prepared for the meeting, Richard's thoughts kept returning to the deleted files and the mysterious phone call. Who was behind this? Who had the power to erase evidence and silence those who spoke out? The answers were out there, and Richard was determined to find them, before it was too late. Richard sat in his office, the weight of what he had uncovered slowly sinking in. The more he pieced together the evidence, the more he realized that what he had stumbled upon wasn't just an issue with customer service. No, this was far more insidious. The company's entire service model was being manipulated, and it wasn't just a few rogue employees, it was a group within the upper echelons of the leadership. The entire structure of the company had been compromised, and their actions were having a ripple effect, influencing every aspect of the company's operations, from policies to its very culture. The more Richard thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident or something that could be fixed with a simple memo. No, this was something much deeper. The treatment of regular customers was just the tip of the iceberg. He needed to find out exactly who was pulling the strings, and more importantly, what their ultimate goal was. There was no way he could let this go without exposing the full extent of the conspiracy. Richard's resolve hardened. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The stakes were too high. And the longer he let this fester, the worse it would get. He needed more evidence. And he needed it fast. He had already started gathering information. But now it was time to dive deeper. He reached out to Grace Foster, a journalist he had worked with in the past. Grace was known for her investigative work, particularly when it came to corporate corruption. She was no stranger to the underworld of big business. And Richard knew she could help him uncover the truth. Over the phone, they quickly arranged a meeting. And within hours, she was sitting across from him in his office, her notebook ready. "I've been following some rumors about your company," Grace said, her eyes sharp as she studied Richard. "I've heard whispers about unusual activities, things that don't add up. You've got some serious problems, don't you?" Richard nodded, his face tight. "You have no idea. It's worse than I thought. I'm starting to believe that a group within my own leadership team is behind this." Grace leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean they're purposely distorting the company's values? How deep does it go?" "I don't know yet," Richard replied, "but I need you to help me get to the bottom of this. I've already found proof of manipulation. But I need more. I need access to their communications, their strategies. If I can expose the real motive behind all this, I can stop it." Grace agreed without hesitation. The two worked tirelessly over the following days, poring over confidential emails, internal memos, and meeting transcripts. As they dug deeper, the conspiracy began to unravel. Richard's suspicions were confirmed. There was a coordinated effort to steer the company in a direction that prioritized a select few and shut out the majority of customers. But what shook him to his core was the extent of the plan. One night, after hours of sifting through documents, Richard found something that made his blood run cold. Hidden within a series of encrypted emails was a detailed blueprint. It wasn't just about skewing customer service, it was about controlling the entire company. One of the company's highest-ranking executives, Gregory Spencer, had devised a scheme to take full control of the company's branches, severing ties with key partners, and consolidating power in his hands alone. Spencer had been working behind the scenes to quietly orchestrate a takeover, making the company a personal empire. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. He had always trusted Gregory. The man had been with the company for years and had played a significant role in its early success. But now, Richard realized he had been duped. Spencer wasn't just a bystander in all of this, he was the architect of the chaos. Richard felt a storm brewing in his chest. The documents laid out a frighteningly precise plan. Gregory aimed to systematically weaken the company's most important relationships and assets, all while putting the blame on the regular customers and shifting the focus to VIPs. His endgame? To take control of the company's entire operation, sidelining Richard and others in the process. As Richard stared at the screen, his mind raced. Gregory Spencer was no longer just an executive, he was now the embodiment of everything Richard had sworn to fight against. This was betrayal at the highest level. And it wasn't just business, it was personal. Richard's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Grace. "I've got more. There's a backdoor deal that's been set up with one of your biggest competitors. They've been planning a merger behind your back. Gregory's already made the arrangements." The blood drained from Richard's face. A merger? With the competition? That was the final straw. The depth of the manipulation was staggering. This wasn't just about gaining control of the company, it was about destroying everything Richard had built. He sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. He had reached a crossroads. The time had come to decide: expose Gregory Spencer and risk bringing the company down with him, or continue digging, putting himself and those around him in more danger. But Richard knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let Gregory destroy everything. He had to stop this madness now, even if it meant sacrificing his own safety, his own career. This was bigger than him. It was about saving the company, and the people who depended on it. With a heavy sigh, Richard made his decision. He would bring this to light, even if it cost him everything. Richard sat in his office, staring at the mountain of evidence before him. The conspiracy he had uncovered was more twisted and deep-rooted than he had ever imagined. Every document, every email, every secret meeting, it all pointed to a deliberate attempt to hijack the company and seize control. Richard had reached the point of no return. The moment had come to expose the culprits and restore integrity to the company. But as he prepared for the public revelation, a shadow loomed over him. Gregory Spencer, the mastermind behind it all. Gregory Spencer, the company's senior vice president, had always been a trusted ally. For years, they had worked side by side to build this company into a powerhouse. But now, Richard was beginning to see Gregory for what he truly was, a manipulative schemer. Willing to destroy everything Richard had built to satisfy his own ambitions. Gregory was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating the flawed policies. And now, Richard was determined to bring him down. But just as Richard was about to finalize his plan to expose Gregory's wrongdoing, the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. But Richard didn't hesitate. He picked it up, his instincts on high alert. Richard, Gregory's voice came through the line. Calm and measured. "We need to talk." The tone of Gregory's voice sent a chill down Richard's spine. He had known this conversation was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the weight of it. Gregory wanted to meet in person. The threat was palpable. Richard agreed to meet Gregory at the company's executive lounge, a neutral space where they often held important meetings. As he drove there, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. He had already found the proof. Now, it was a matter of confronting the man who had betrayed him. When Richard arrived, Gregory was already waiting. He stood by the window, looking out over the city, his hands clasped behind his back. As Richard entered, Gregory turned, a calm smile on his face. But Richard could see through it, the tension in Gregory's posture, the calculating glint in his eyes. "Richard," Gregory said, his voice smooth but cold. "I've been expecting you." Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you've been doing, Gregory. I know about the manipulation. The policies designed to prioritize VIP customers at the expense of everyone else. It's all been a scheme to grab power. And I'm going to expose you." Gregory's smile never faltered. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually. But let me tell you something. You're not going to like where this goes." Richard's heart raced. He could feel the threat in Gregory's words. But he was determined not to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," Richard replied, his voice steady. "The truth will come out. And when it does, you'll be the one who has to answer for your actions." Gregory's expression darkened, and for the first time, Richard saw the true menace in his eyes. "You think you've uncovered everything? You think you're in control of this situation? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Richard's pulse quickened, but he stood firm. "What are you going to do, Gregory? You can't intimidate me into backing down." Gregory took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I don't need to intimidate you. I have something much more powerful. Something that could ruin you." Richard's mind raced, but he didn't let his guard down. "What are you talking about?" Gregory's voice dropped to a whisper, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I have evidence that links you to several illegal deals in the past. Deals that could destroy your career. You've made your fair share of mistakes, Richard. And I'm the only one who knows about them." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. Gregory was not only trying to take control of the company, he was holding Richard's past over his head. A past Richard had worked so hard to keep buried. Gregory leaned in closer, his voice laced with venom. "If you drop this investigation and back off, I'll make sure those secrets stay hidden. I can protect you from the consequences. But if you push me, Richard, I'll make sure the world knows what you've done." Richard's mind spun. The weight of Gregory's words hung in the air. This wasn't just a business fight anymore, it was personal. Gregory had the power to destroy everything. And he was using it against Richard. For a moment, Richard stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. But then, something clicked inside him. He wasn't going to let Gregory win. "Not like this. Are you threatening me?" Richard asked, his voice steady but full of conviction. "Because it sounds like a threat." Gregory chuckled darkly. "I'm not threatening you, Richard. I'm giving you a choice. Walk away from this, and you keep your secrets safe. Keep digging, and I'll make sure you lose everything. You'll be nothing." Richard's mind was a whirlwind. But one thing was clear. He couldn't back down now. The truth needed to come out. No matter the cost. He had to expose Gregory for what he was, a liar. A manipulator. A fraud. I'm not backing down. Gregory, Richard said, his voice filled with resolve. You may have your secrets. But I have mine too. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Gregory's eyes narrowed, but there was no turning back now. Richard knew the road ahead would be treacherous. But he was ready for the battle. The fight for his company, for his reputation, had only just begun. Richard had barely slept for the past few days. The weight of his decision pressed on him. He knew what he had to do. But the cost was high. He couldn't just sit back and let Gregory Spencer, or anyone else for that matter, manipulate the company for their own gain. There was too much at stake. Not just for him but for the future of the company and everyone who had placed their trust in it. As he paced in his office, the urgency of the situation became even clearer. Gregory had made his threats, wielding Richard's past mistakes like a weapon. Yet, instead of cowering, Richard's resolve only hardened. He wasn't going to let the past control his future. Not this time. He had a company to protect. And he wasn't about to let one man destroy everything he'd worked for. Richard had already begun taking action. With the help of Grace Foster, the investigative journalist, and Paul Anderson, the former employee who had been part of the inner workings of the conspiracy. Richard began to collect more and more evidence. Each piece he uncovered painted a picture of a conspiracy so deeply ingrained within the company's leadership that it threatened to consume everything. It was time for the public reveal. Richard knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. He called for an all-hands meeting with the company's senior leadership and key stakeholders. This would be the moment when the truth would come to light. The truth about Gregory, about the manipulation, and about the future of the company. As the day of the meeting approached, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had already sensed it. This wasn't going to be as simple as walking into a room and presenting the evidence. His instincts told him that Gregory wouldn't go down without a fight. He began to prepare for the worst, double-checking the documents and confirming with Grace and Paul that they were all set. On the morning of the meeting, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Richard walked into the conference room, his heart racing but his mind sharp. Grace was there, sitting quietly at the back, ready to cover the story. Paul, too, had a seat at the table, prepared to offer his testimony. Richard was ready to expose the corruption and take the first step toward reclaiming his company. But as the meeting began, Richard's stomach twisted. One of his closest allies, Paul Anderson, was acting strange. Richard had noticed it the day before, but now it was undeniable. Paul seemed distant, distracted, as Richard began his opening remarks, preparing to drop the bombshell on Gregory and the board. Paul shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortably at Gregory. Richard went through the motions, speaking about the importance of transparency and integrity, when he suddenly felt a pang of doubt. His eyes flicked to Paul again. Something was off, and just as Richard was about to present the damning evidence, the twist he feared the most unfolded in real time. Paul stood up, interrupting Richard mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, Richard, but I can't let you do this," Paul said, his voice trembling but firm. "I've been in your shoes before. But you're making a terrible mistake. I can't let you destroy everything we've built." Richard's heart stopped. Paul, the man who had once stood by him, had just betrayed him. Without a word, Paul turned to Gregory Spencer and handed over a set of documents, Richard's evidence. "I'm afraid this is all I can say," Paul said quietly. The room fell silent as the air seemed to thicken. Richard's mind raced. This was it. This was what Gregory had been waiting for. He'd known that someone on the inside would try to stop him. But not like this. His own ally had just handed Gregory the very weapon he needed to destroy him. Gregory stood up, his face a mask of calm satisfaction. "Thank you, Paul," he said, his voice dripping with fake gratitude. "You've made the right choice." Richard felt the walls closing in. His plan was crumbling before his eyes. The documents he had spent days gathering, the testimonies that were supposed to change everything, were now in Gregory's hands. He was losing the upper hand, and he knew it, but something inside him refused to give up. "I'll never back down, Gregory," Richard said, his voice firm despite the chaos swirling around him. "You may have the evidence, but I'm not finished yet. I will expose the truth, no matter what it costs." Gregory raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the moment. You think you can fight this? You think you can win? You've just lost everything. Richard, all of your credibility, your reputation, it's gone. You'll be finished. Richard stood tall, the weight of the betrayal heavy on his shoulders. But he wasn't done yet. He still had allies. Grace, the journalist, had been gathering information on Gregory's dealings outside of the company. He wasn't going to let Gregory win. Not now. Not after everything. Maybe I've lost today, Richard said, his voice quiet but resolute. But this isn't over. You haven't won. You're not going to destroy everything I've worked for. I will take you down, Gregory, and when I do, you'll regret this. Gregory smiled, but there was something in his eyes that Richard couldn't quite place. It was as if he knew something Richard didn't, something that would make everything even more complicated. But Richard didn't care. He was ready for the next step. Whatever it was, he was not going to let Gregory win. Not this time. And this time, he had no intention of losing. Richard Wheeler sat alone in his office, the weight of the betrayal still hanging heavily in the air. He had always prided himself on being a leader who fought for the right cause, who didn't back down in the face of adversity. But the past few days had shaken him to his core. First, Paul's betrayal, then Gregory's manipulation. It felt like everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming pressure, one thing was clear. Richard wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let Gregory destroy everything. After much reflection, Richard made a decision. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He was going to fight back, not just for himself, but for the future of the company. The company he had worked so hard to build. The company that thousands of employees relied on. This was bigger than personal vendettas. It was about justice. About doing the right thing. With Grace Foster's help, they continued to dig deeper into Gregory's financial activities. They needed proof. Something that would force the leadership to listen. Something that could expose Gregory's web of manipulation. After days of careful planning, Richard, Grace, and a few loyal allies inside the company, including a few financial experts, were ready to take action. They had gathered enough evidence to expose Gregory's financial misdeeds and the entire scheme he had been orchestrating behind the scenes. Richard felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest as the date for the meeting approached. He called for a confidential gathering of the company's senior leadership, including Gregory Spencer. The goal was simple: confront Gregory with the evidence they had collected, and show the rest of the board the truth about what had been happening inside the company. The morning of the meeting, Richard's office was filled with an air of quiet anticipation. The staff had been instructed to keep the meeting a secret, and only a select few knew about the upcoming confrontation. But something still felt off. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't going to be as easy as presenting the facts. Gregory had already shown how far he was willing to go to protect himself. As Richard entered the meeting room, he found the executives already seated, their faces tense but expectant. Gregory was there too, his usual calm demeanor plastered across his face. He greeted Richard with a smooth smile, but Richard could see the hidden tension in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a normal meeting. Richard wasted no time. He started by laying out the evidence. Step by step, he pointed out the financial discrepancies, the secret meetings, the manipulation of company policies, all of it. As the documents flashed on the screen behind him, Richard could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. The truth was out. But just as he was about to reveal the final piece of evidence, something that would irrevocably shatter Gregory's grip on the company, he felt a shift in the room. He glanced to the side and saw John Bennett, the company's top legal counsel, standing up. Richard's heart skipped a beat. John had been one of his most trusted allies. But now, as he stood there, he felt an uncomfortable sense of dread. "Richard, I think we need to reconsider this," John said, his voice calm but filled with something else, something unsettling. "I've been working closely with Gregory on the strategic direction of the company. This move, it's not in the best interest of the business." Richard's stomach sank. His mind raced. John had been one of the few people he thought he could trust. But now, it was clear. John had just aligned himself with Gregory. His betrayal hit like a sucker punch. How many more people were involved in this? How deep did this corruption run? Before Richard could respond, John turned to Gregory, nodding slightly. "I think it's time we move forward with the plans we've been discussing." The company's future depends on it. Richard's mind spun. It wasn't just one betrayal. It was an orchestrated effort to sabotage everything he had worked for. John had handed Gregory the perfect opportunity to destroy Richard's carefully crafted plan. Without warning, Gregory stood up, his presence commanding. "Richard, I think you've made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice dripping with cold confidence. "You've played your hand, but now, it's too late. You've lost." The room fell into a tense silence as Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in. The evidence he had gathered, every single piece, was worthless now. The documents had been altered, the data tampered with, and John had tipped Gregory off just in time to make sure it all fell apart. Richard's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the situation felt hopeless. Gregory had already anticipated his moves. The carefully constructed plan had been ruined, and now, Richard was standing at the precipice, staring down at the consequences of his failure. But then, something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Not like this. Not after everything he had fought for. "Maybe you think you've won, Gregory," Richard said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But this is far from over. You may have won this round, but I'll find a way to expose you. No one can stay hidden forever." Gregory's smile faltered for a moment, but only for a second. "You're out of moves, Richard. There's nothing left." But Richard wasn't so sure. He still had one card left to play: the press, the public, and the power of transparency. Even if he couldn't trust the people in this room, there were others outside, others who would help him fight for the truth. Richard made his decision. He wasn't going to give up. This was just the beginning of his fight, not the end. After everything had collapsed around him, Richard Wheeler stood at the precipice of defeat. But he wasn't willing to fall. The past few days had been a whirlwind of chaos, betrayals, sabotage, and the crushing realization that Gregory Spencer was much more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming challenge, Richard refused to give in. The fight was far from over. And now, more than ever, he needed to gather his strength, reclaim his power, and make one final stand. Richard sat at his desk, his thoughts racing. Grace Foster, the journalist who had helped him gather evidence, was the first ally he called. He knew he needed someone who could help him expose Gregory to the public. Grace had a network of contacts, and she had a way with words that could stir the public into action. But Richard knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed more people on their side, people who could help them fight back against the web of lies Gregory had spun. He thought of Paul Anderson, the former employee who had helped him uncover much of the conspiracy. Though Paul had been the one to betray him during the last confrontation, Richard still had faith in his ability to provide valuable information. He called Paul, and the two met in secret. The conversation was tense, but in the end, Paul agreed to help, albeit reluctantly. The damage had been done, but it was time to move forward, and Paul's knowledge could be the key to unlocking the last of the evidence they needed. Richard's next step was to organize a series of covert meetings with some of the remaining loyalists within the company. These were people who had stuck by him throughout the turmoil, and he was determined to strengthen their resolve. Together, they would dig into the files that had been deleted, find any remaining traces of the financial misconduct, and prepare to take their case to the authorities. With Grace's connections and Paul's knowledge, they hoped to piece together the last bit of evidence. Richard knew it wouldn't be easy. Gregory had already proven how far he was willing to go to maintain control. The public meeting that Gregory had scheduled would likely be his attempt to turn the tide, to clear his name, and to convince everyone that Richard was the one with something to hide. But Richard wasn't going to play Gregory's game. He had a different plan, one that would expose the truth to the world in a way Gregory couldn't control. As they worked tirelessly, the pieces began to come together. Richard felt a small spark of hope, even as the weight of the battle ahead loomed over him. It was a race against time. He knew Gregory would stop at nothing to discredit him, to turn the public against him, and to destroy his credibility. The media was already in Gregory's corner, and he had the power to sway the public with ease. But Richard wasn't the type to back down. He understood the game, and now, he would play it better than Gregory ever could. Instead of participating in Gregory's planned public meeting, Richard decided to take a different approach. He would reveal the truth on his own terms. And he would do it in a way that Gregory couldn't manipulate. It was time to take the battle outside of the boardroom and into the public eye. The day of Gregory's planned event arrived. The conference room was filled with executives, investors, and key stakeholders. Richard knew that Gregory would be pulling all the strings, using his influence to make sure the meeting went according to plan. But Richard wasn't going to let that happen. He had a backup plan. A strategy that involved a carefully timed press release that would expose Gregory's financial manipulation, the rigged policies, and the dirty dealings that had been taking place behind the scenes. As Richard and his team prepared, the tension in the air was palpable. Gregory stood at the front of the room, presenting his version of the story, painting himself as a victim of Richard's paranoia and misunderstanding. He played his part perfectly, using his charm and strategic manipulation to deflect attention away from his own wrongdoings. But Richard wasn't buying it. He wasn't fooled by Gregory's polished rhetoric. The twist came when Gregory, seeing the challenge in Richard's eyes, made his move. With a sly smile, he announced that he would be holding a public event, a grand press conference designed to clear his name and to expose the supposed false accusations against him. Gregory had already set the stage, carefully manipulating the media and the narrative to his advantage. He knew this was his chance to control the story before Richard could get a word in. "Richard," Gregory said, his tone dripping with faux sympathy, "I'm giving you a chance to step down gracefully. You have nothing to prove here. Let's end this now, for the sake of the company." But Richard didn't flinch. He had expected this move, and he was ready. "I don't need to step down, Gregory. The truth is out there, and I'm going to make sure it comes to light. You can't control the narrative anymore." Gregory's smile faltered for a split second, and Richard knew he had struck a nerve. It wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point. Richard was no longer the underdog. He had the truth on his side, and he was ready to fight for it. With the press conference looming, Richard prepared to make his move. His team was in place. The evidence was ready, and the press release was set to go live. He wasn't going to let Gregory dictate the outcome of this battle. It was time for the world to hear the truth, and Richard was going to make sure they did. Even as Gregory schemed, Richard remained calm, knowing that this was only the beginning of the end for Gregory and his network of corruption. Richard wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight with everything he had. Richard stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with a steady hand. The calmness he felt was almost unsettling. Everything had led to this moment, the culmination of months of deception, betrayal, and broken trust. Gregory Spencer had thought he could manipulate Richard's company into the ground. But Richard was done running. Today, he was going to expose Gregory for what he truly was and reclaim the company that had been slipping from his grasp. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard walked into the conference room. His trusted allies, Grace Foster, the journalist, and William Hanks, the secret witness, were already there, ready to play their parts. William had once been a close confidant of Gregory, and now he was providing critical information that would tear down the walls Gregory had carefully constructed. Richard had seen too much to back down now. The time for fighting in the shadows was over. He was going to shine a spotlight on Gregory's corruption and force the truth into the open. The room was filled with the key players, top executives, shareholders, and members of the press. Everyone had gathered for a pivotal meeting that would determine the company's future. As Richard sat at the head of the table, his heart beat with purpose. Today wasn't just about saving his reputation, it was about saving the integrity of the company he had built, the people who depended on it, and the future of everyone involved. "I've called you all here today to reveal the truth," Richard began, his voice strong and unwavering. "For too long, we've been living under the shadow of corruption. The leadership of this company has been manipulated, and now, it's time to expose what's really been happening behind closed doors." Gregory Spencer sat near the end of the table, his steely gaze fixed on Richard. He hadn't said a word yet, but Richard could feel the power in the room shifting. Gregory had spent months carefully orchestrating his rise to power. Now, Richard was about to tear that illusion apart. As the meeting progressed, Richard laid out the evidence, financial records, secret emails, and internal memos. Everything was there. The web of deceit Gregory had built was being unraveled piece by piece. For a moment, Richard thought he saw a flicker of doubt in Gregory's eyes. This was it. The moment when Gregory's empire would come crashing down. But then, just as Richard was about to reveal the final nail in the coffin, the unexpected happened. One of his own allies, someone he had trusted implicitly, stood up. It was Claire Matthews, one of his senior employees, who had been helping him organize the meeting. Claire had always been a loyal and diligent worker. She had been with Richard through thick and thin. And now, she was standing in front of him, her expression unreadable. "Richard," Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't let you do this." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He stared at Claire in disbelief. She had always been one of his strongest allies, someone who had supported him in the darkest of times. But now, she was standing with Gregory. "You're working with him?" Richard asked, the betrayal cutting through him like a knife. Claire glanced at Gregory, then back at Richard. "I didn't have a choice. He has information on me. Things I thought I had left behind. I had to protect myself. You don't understand, Richard. He's dangerous." Gregory's smile was smug, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "It's over, Richard," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "You've lost." Claire made the right decision. She knew what was at stake. Richard's mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Claire, the one person he had trusted most, had just betrayed him. She had handed Gregory everything he needed to destroy Richard's case. All of the evidence that had been so carefully gathered, gone. The plans, the strategies, the secret documents, everything had been compromised. It felt as though the ground beneath him was collapsing. And for a moment, he wasn't sure what to do next. The room seemed to close in on him as Gregory continued to gloat, basking in his victory. The press, the shareholders, the executives, they were all watching, waiting for Richard to crumble. But Richard refused to give them the satisfaction. He couldn't let this be the end. "I won't stop," Richard said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "You can betray me, you can take everything from me, but I will not let you destroy what this company stands for." Gregory laughed, clearly enjoying Richard's desperation. "You think you can still win, Richard? The media is already on my side. The public will see this as your failure. You'll be nothing. It's over." But Richard wasn't finished. He looked over at Grace, who had been sitting quietly in the back, waiting for her moment. She had been working on her own angle, building a network of sources that could provide the final pieces of the puzzle. Richard knew this was his last shot. With one final, defiant look at Gregory, he turned to Grace. "Do it," he said. Grace stood up, her face calm but determined. As she made her way to the front of the room, Richard felt a surge of hope. This wasn't over yet. The truth was going to come out. And it was going to come out now. As Grace prepared to release her report, Richard felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't going to win this battle the way he had planned. But he wasn't going to lose either. He would fight with everything he had. And he would bring the truth to light, no matter what it took. And then, just as the first pieces of the story started to spread, the door to the room slammed open. More of Gregory's people had arrived, trying to halt the proceedings. But it was too late. The truth was out, and Richard wasn't going down without a fight. The final stage had arrived. Richard Wheeler stood in front of the courthouse, the morning sun casting long shadows over the steps, his thoughts swirling with anticipation and dread. This was the moment he had been working toward for months, the moment when everything he had fought for would either collapse or come to fruition. Gregory Spencer had orchestrated a plan to ruin everything Richard had built. But today, Richard was ready to take him down. Once and for all, Richard had gathered a formidable team. Grace Foster, the journalist whose reporting had already turned the tide of public opinion in his favor, was there, her presence a reminder that the world was watching. Paul Anderson, the reluctant ally who had once betrayed him but now stood firm in support, was also present, ready to testify. And then there was William Hanks, the former employee who had been critical in bringing the truth to light. Together, they had built a case strong enough to shake the very foundation of Gregory's empire. The court proceedings began, and the room was packed with media, stakeholders, and the company's key leaders. Gregory sat across from Richard, his face stoic, but Richard could see the tension in his eyes. He had been anticipating this moment, preparing for it just as Richard had. But Richard wasn't about to back down. This was his chance to expose the lies, the manipulation, and the corruption that had plagued the company for far too long. The first few hours of the trial were tense. Both sides presented their arguments, but Richard could feel the momentum shifting in his favor. Every piece of evidence that had been gathered, every document and email, every financial irregularity, it all pointed directly at Gregory and his team. The manipulations were too blatant, too obvious for anyone to ignore. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, after all, he was going to win this. But Gregory was not the type to go down without a fight. As the trial progressed, Richard noticed something troubling. Several key witnesses had started to hesitate, their statements becoming less clear, less forceful. It wasn't until the final moments of the morning session that Richard realized what had been happening. Gregory, ever the strategist, had begun threatening the witnesses. He was using his power, his wealth, and his influence to intimidate anyone who might testify against him. Some had been forced to withdraw their statements, while others seemed too scared to speak. Richard's heart sank. This wasn't just a battle in the courtroom, it was a full-scale war. Gregory had already begun to manipulate the media, trying to sway public opinion in his favor. Richard knew that the case wasn't over yet. He had to find a way to push through this final hurdle. Then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the unthinkable happened. A figure stood up in the back of the courtroom, Catherine Liu, a senior employee who had been one of Gregory's most trusted people. Richard had expected Gregory to use her as a pawn in his defense. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. Catherine walked forward with a calm and determined expression. And for the first time in the trial, the room fell silent. "I've been part of this company for over a decade," Catherine began, her voice strong, yet carrying a hint of sorrow. "I've seen the changes, the deals, the decisions that were made in the shadows. But today, I cannot stand by and watch Gregory destroy everything we've worked for. The truth must come out." With that, Catherine placed a stack of documents on the table, documents that were, without a doubt, the final piece of evidence needed to seal Gregory's fate. She spoke of the secret meetings, the altered financial reports, the insider trading, all of it. Everything Richard had suspected, everything he had been fighting to prove, was now laid bare in front of the judge, the jury, and the world. Gregory's face turned ashen. He stood up, his hand slamming against the table. But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. The truth had been exposed. There was no escape. As Catherine finished her testimony, the room erupted into chaos. Gregory's legal team scrambled to find a way out. But there was no denying it. The evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses who had stayed loyal to Richard had made it clear that Gregory's empire of lies was about to come crashing down. The judge called for a recess, and Richard, though exhausted, allowed himself a brief moment of victory. The battle wasn't over yet, but he had made it through the hardest part. The evidence had been presented, and Gregory had no way to spin this. But Richard knew the cost of victory. It had taken everything he had, his reputation, his integrity, his trust in people, and even if he won, the company would never be the same again. When the trial resumed, the judge wasted no time. With the overwhelming evidence presented, the verdict was clear. Gregory Spencer, along with his co-conspirators, was found guilty of multiple charges, including financial fraud, insider trading, and abuse of power. The ruling was swift and decisive, and it sent shockwaves through the entire company. But as the court dismissed, Richard knew that this was only the beginning. The company had a long road ahead of it, and it would take more than just winning a trial to rebuild what had been destroyed. He had learned that the real work, the real battle, was only just beginning. Gregory had been taken down, but the system that had allowed him to rise still existed, and it was something Richard would have to fight to change, piece by piece. For now, though, Richard allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had done it, the truth had prevailed, but there was still more work to be done. The battle for justice and integrity was ongoing, and Richard knew that he couldn't rest until the entire system was reformed. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The courtroom was quieter than Richard had expected. After months of tension, sleepless nights, and more than a few false starts, Gregory Spencer was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Richard could feel the weight of the moment settling over him as the judge read the verdict. Gregory had been found guilty on multiple charges: fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. His empire had crumbled, and Richard could now begin the long and difficult process of rebuilding the company he had once feared he would lose forever. It wasn't just the legal victory that felt satisfying, it was the fact that Gregory's reign of manipulation was over. The press had already begun to cover the fallout, painting Gregory as the villain he had always been. Richard had won, but the battle was far from over. The victory didn't come without a price, and the journey ahead would be long and challenging. Yet Richard felt a sense of relief. At least for now, the truth was out there, and Gregory's power had been stripped away. Richard's team had been crucial in making this happen. Grace Foster, the journalist who had tirelessly followed the story, was ready to help him expose the final layers of the conspiracy. William Hanks, the former employee who had once stood by Gregory's side but now stood by Richard, had provided the evidence that had turned the tide. And Paul Anderson, despite his earlier betrayal, had played an essential part in ensuring the truth came to light. Together, they had taken down Gregory Spencer. But as Richard looked around the room at the other executives and board members, he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Richard knew that taking down Gregory wasn't enough. The rot that had spread through the company had infected more than just Gregory, it had seeped into the system itself. Gregory had been the figurehead, the one manipulating the puppet strings. But there were others who had worked with him, who had been complicit in the system of corruption. Richard had to address this deeper issue if the company was to ever truly recover. As Gregory was escorted out of the courtroom, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The victory felt hollow, and as much as he wanted to bask in the moment, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that things weren't quite right. He had exposed Gregory's corruption. Yes, but had he truly uncovered everything? The question lingered in the back of his mind. Days passed, and Richard began the process of trying to restore order to the company. Board meetings were held, decisions were made, and new policies were put in place to ensure that such abuse of power would never happen again. Richard made it clear to everyone that the company was being restructured from the ground up, but the deeper he dug into the company's inner workings, the more troubling it became. There were still those who refused to let go of the old ways. Those who secretly worked to maintain the status quo. One afternoon, as Richard sat in a meeting with his leadership team, the realization hit him hard. Some of the same people who had supported Gregory were still holding on to their power. They were quietly undermining his efforts to reform the company. These were the people who, despite knowing the truth, chose to ignore it for personal gain. They continued to manipulate decisions, making it clear that they had not learned the lessons Richard had hoped for. As he sat there, listening to their subtle resistance, Richard had to make a decision. He could try to negotiate with these people, make compromises, and slowly rebuild the company, hoping that over time the culture would change. Or he could go all in, confronting them head on, demanding that they step aside and make way for the new order he was trying to create. The question was not only about what was best for the company, but also about what it would take to truly change the culture of an organization that had been so deeply entrenched in corruption. The decision weighed heavily on him. He could feel the pressure mounting. He had fought for the truth and won. But that victory had come at a personal cost. He had lost friends, allies, and perhaps even some of his own integrity along the way. But he couldn't stop now. The company needed a complete overhaul, and it needed someone willing to take the hard steps, even if it meant alienating people who had been loyal for years. Richard called a private meeting with his closest allies, Grace, William, and Paul. They were the ones who had stood by him, and now they would be the ones to help him navigate this final, crucial stage. Together, they discussed the next steps. Richard knew that if he wanted to ensure the company's survival, he needed to act decisively. The resistance within the company had to be dealt with swiftly and thoroughly. "I'm not going to stop," Richard said, his voice firm but weary. "We've exposed Gregory, but this corruption goes deeper. If I don't take action now, the company will just revert back to the way it was. We've got to root it out completely. Grace nodded. You're right, but we can't do this alone. We need support from the board. From people outside the company who can hold these people accountable. Richard agreed. We'll do it. We'll fight for the company. For what it's supposed to stand for. But we have to be ready. This is going to get ugly. And so, Richard set in motion the final phase of the battle. The court victory had been a huge step. But the real fight was just beginning. The company needed a new vision. One that was built on honesty, transparency, and accountability. He was prepared to make the hard choices. To risk everything. And to fight for what was right, even if it meant losing more along the way. The path ahead was unclear. But Richard knew one thing for sure. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. The real work had only just begun. And it was time to take the fight to the very core of the company. Where the rot had first begun. The dust had finally settled. The courtroom drama had come to a close. And Richard Wheeler, the CEO who had fought so long and hard to expose the truth, had emerged victorious. His main adversary, Gregory Spencer, along with his inner circle of corrupt executives, had been removed from power. Their webs of lies and manipulation had been unraveled. Their actions now fully exposed to the world. Richard had not only salvaged the company, but he had restored a sense of integrity and justice that had been long absent. But the victory, as sweet as it was, felt incomplete. Richard had accomplished what many thought was impossible. But something still gnawed at him. The company was recovering, yes, but the more he delved into the changes needed to restore it to its rightful path, the more he realized that his battle was far from over. Removing one corrupt figurehead didn't change the entire system that had been built around them. It didn't erase the years of deceit, the manipulation, or the deeply ingrained toxic culture that had permeated every level of the organization. In the months following Gregory's downfall, Richard had worked tirelessly to implement reforms. He began by purging the remaining executives who had been complicit in Gregory's schemes. He changed the company's policies, making them more transparent and more accountable. Richard brought in new blood, people who had integrity, who were committed to ensuring the company never again fell into the same traps. Slowly, the company started to regain its former reputation, and even customers who had once turned their backs on them began to return. But it wasn't enough. Richard knew that the company had a long road ahead. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and there was always the looming threat of those who had resisted the changes. Richard understood that. He was no stranger to the weight of leadership. But the journey of true reform, the kind of change that would prevent this from happening again, was still just beginning. Every day, new challenges emerged, and he had to be ready to face them head on. Just as Richard thought he had a handle on things, something unexpected happened. One night, as he was going over company reports in his office, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. "I know you think you've won, Richard," the voice said, low and calm. But Gregory Spencer wasn't the only one pulling the strings. Richard's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The voice continued. "There's more, much more. You think the company is clean now. But you're wrong. There's still someone in the shadows, waiting to strike, and they're much closer than you think." Richard's mind raced. What was this? Who was behind the phone call? Could it be another of Gregory's loyalists? Or was this someone even more dangerous? His instincts told him not to trust it, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't ignore it. The caller didn't give his name, only a warning. "You've fought hard to expose one truth, Richard, but there are more out there, and they're far from over. You can't rest yet. The real battle is just beginning." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard staring at his phone, the words echoing in his mind. Who could he trust now? Was it true that there were still forces at play, working behind the scenes? He had already lost so much in this fight: his trust in people, his reputation, his belief in the goodness of the system. Could he really go back into that world of deceit, of power-hungry individuals who would do anything to maintain control? Richard took a deep breath. He had come so far, and he couldn't stop now. He had promised himself, and everyone who believed in him, that he would restore integrity to the company. But if there was more to uncover, then he would find it. He couldn't walk away now. Not when the company, and everything he had fought for, was at stake. The next morning, Richard gathered his closest allies, Grace Foster, Paul Anderson, and William Hanks. He told them about the mysterious phone call. They listened in silence, the weight of the information heavy on their shoulders. "We've got to get ahead of this," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We need to dig deeper. If there's anyone left in the shadows, we'll find them, but we have to be careful. We can't let our guard down. We've come too far." Grace nodded. "You're right. We've exposed one layer, but this could be just the tip of the iceberg. We need to know who's still involved and who's hiding." Paul added, "We can't let this go. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth will always come out. But we need to be patient, methodical." The group agreed. They couldn't afford to make hasty decisions. They had to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Richard made a decision then, one that would shape the next phase of his leadership. "We're not going to let this company fall back into the hands of corruption. I will continue this fight, no matter how difficult. The truth will always be worth fighting for." As the team began their work in silence, Richard felt the weight of his decision. The battle was not over. He had to keep moving forward. But now, more than ever, he knew that the fight for the company's soul was ongoing. No matter what came next, he would continue to seek the truth and fight for what was right. No matter how many more obstacles appeared, the road ahead was long. But Richard was ready. He would not back down. As we wrap up this eye-opening story, it's clear that leadership isn't just about making decisions from the top. It's about understanding what's happening at the ground level. When the CEO stepped into his own retail store, he uncovered not just a flaw in customer service but a deeper issue with company culture. The lesson here is simple. Transparency and understanding your team are key to real change. What would you have done in the CEO's shoes? Do you think the employee's actions were justifiable, or was it a sign of a deeper problem? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that uncover the real world behind the headlines. Thank you for watching.